further ado, we are going to introduce to you our amazing keynote speaker, Dr. Kenneth Braswell. You can check your agenda and also scan the QR code if you want to find out a lot more information about Dr. Braswell. But for now, I'm going to introduce you and give you a shortened version of his bio as he prepared himself to come and bring greetings. Kenneth Braswell is the Chief Executive Officer of Fathers Incorporated, a widely recognized national and international nonprofit organization supporting fathers, practitioners, researchers, and policymakers that provides capacity building services to thousands of organizations working to ensure that fathers contribute to the healthy well-being of their children. He brings 30 years of collective work experience managing and leading fatherhood and community programs. Additionally, he serves as the National Director of the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, directing and guiding the strategic activities of the Clearinghouse. Without further ado, please help me welcome our keynote speaker today, Kenneth Braswell. Thank you. Oh, you're such a gentleman. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My mother would have something to say if I didn't hold my hand out before you were walking down the stairs. So it always reminds me of how I should show up as a gentleman in this world. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You guys ready for an awesome day?
Yes.
No, I am. Let's give everyone who had a hand and a mind and some energy and planning this conference a loud round of applause. Dr. Martin, my child arrived just the other day. He came to a world in a usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking before I knew it, and as he grew, he said, I'm going to be just like you, Dad. I know I'm going to be like you. That's the opening lyrics to Cats in the Cradle. So I encourage you to read, to listen to that song. And listen to it with your eyes closed, because I think it's appropriate for this conversation today as we talk about fathers in focus. But before I go on, there's a couple of things that I have to do, because if you can for me, in one loud happy birthday, say happy birthday to my wife, Mrs. Braswell. Just say happy birthday, Mrs. Braswell.
Happy birthday, Mrs. Braswell.
Thank you. So now I get to go back home and say, babe, I went to a conference in Wisconsin and they all wished you a happy birthday today. She was supposed to be with me, but we got this thing going in our life called co-parenting. How many of you know about that? One clap. And we have a 15 and a 17-year-old boy in our household, so we dare not go for anywhere for any amount of time, leaving the two of them in the house by themselves. So we had to make an educated, responsible decision, and I came here to be with you guys, and she stayed here to be with those guys. And so, also, in about 2 weeks, Fathers Incorporated, our organization, will celebrate its 20th anniversary. And I'm very proud of that work. Thank you so much. To my good friend, Dr. Alvin Thomas and Dr. Green, thank you so much for believing in me and asking me to come here so long ago. And congratulations on your podcast and all the work that you're doing. If you do not know, he is making, Dr. Thomas, a serious impact on the work around the country just through the dialogue that he's having from week to week with his podcast. And every honor that he has received so far is deserving. And I congratulate you once again and continue to do the great work that you do. And to Dr. Shim and Dr. Martin, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for really being in my notes, because my whole thing today is telling stories. It's important that we tell stories. Rhonda and her husband who came to pick me up last night at the hotel at like midnight or something like that. Thank you. And Dr. Walsh, I'm not sure if you're in the building. And to my good friend, Dr. Brandon Frame, who will be here this afternoon, who's also doing some incredible work. And some old friends, Terrence Ray, who's in the building, who I probably known that gentleman for over 15, 20 years doing this work in Milwaukee. And Dr. Pate and his incredible work in research. Good to see both of you today. Empathy, that's what we're going to talk about for the next 30, 35 minutes. It's something that I've been hanging my hat on lately because I think it's the core component of why it's so difficult for us to do this work in responsible fatherhood. And I think it's also the piece that makes it so difficult for society to understand the importance and the relevance of fathers. And I think it's not because of a willingness not to do so. It is a disconnect in being empathetic in the sense of putting themselves in our shoes and seeing life from our perspective. And I think one of the best ways to invoke empathy in people is to tell your story. Dr. Martin just said he was overwhelmed by what Dr. Sim said. You know why? Because she told her story. And it brought him into her life and gave him a deeper understanding of A, who she is, and why what she does in this space, and why she's so concerned about fathers. When she told the story about her father having the confidence in her to be equal to her brothers, it's no surprise that she is who she is today, because her father affirmed her before she even knew she needed affirming. How many of you have been affirmed in your life by somebody who's important to you? By raise a hand. And that's what empathy does. So before we get started today, I'm going to tell you what my bio hasn't told you. And it's a story that I started writing my memoir, and wanted to tell a story that was really compelling about an element of my life that I think drives who I am. And it took me about 40 minutes to write this story, and I've been perfecting it. And I want to tell you the story today, but first let me set the context for the story. And so I grew up in a single family home in Brooklyn, New York. An achieving kid, but unchallenged. Not uninterested, unchallenged. I was a little beyond everybody in my social circle, in my academic circle. And when I went to school, I sat in the back of the room and I knew all the answers. I had all the questions, but because no one saw me, I never allowed anyone to see me. And I slipped into a space where I thought I was irrelevant. And I dropped out of high school. And when I dropped out of high school, I literally was out of high school for almost 2 years before my mother knew, because I was that crafty in intercepting the letters that were coming to the mailbox, the phone calls that were coming to the house, manipulating my teachers, faculty, and I had a whole intricate criminal system going on, y'all. And when my mother finally found out, the thing that hit me with it was, I realized that day how much I did not want to disappoint her in me. And that became the driver for me in my life with her. And so fast forward, I go to the military. I get married at 17 years old. My mother had to sign for me to go into the military. Think about this. My mother had to sign for me to go into the military, and then she had to sign my marriage certificate for me to get married, right? We talking 1980s now. But got divorced because I'm young, dumb, not sure what to do with marriage. 2.5-year-old child coming back to New York, and we know that story. Didn't work out, got divorced, and life went on. But I met an impressionable girl, like we all do sometimes. And she came from a 2-family household with her brother, her mom, and her dad. And they had an experience in their lives that I didn't have in mine. And in full view of her life, I felt like I was being raised again. And when she went off to college, she said, "You should come with me." And I said, I don't know anything about college. Like, my household never spoke about college, never spoke about owning a house,
never spoke about owning a car, never spoke about saving money, never spoke about allowances and budgeting and financial stability and all of those kinds of things that we talk to our children about, or at least should talk to our children about. I had never heard that, but I heard it in her household on a regular. The other thing I heard in her household was this whole level of affirmation and how much they said to each other, I love you. Like they never departed from each other without saying, I love you. It was never bye. It was never see you later. Their disconnect or their departure from each other was always, I love you. So it was something that I picked up from that relationship. And so moved upstate New York, enrolled into college, got my own apartment, got me a job as a result of this one girl that I met in Brooklyn, New York. And this is where the story begins. Make sure I got that. But before I get to that, you should know this man. How many of you know this man? He is John Amos, and he played the character role on a 1970s sitcom called Good Times. It was a show about a family in the Cabrini projects of Chicago. And it was him, his wife, his two sons, his daughter, and his nosy neighbor. Always got to put a nosy person in a sitcom, right? And so, but James Amos was more than just a character on TV for many boys in my community that looked like me, and other communities around the country that also looked like me. Because at a time that the country was where it was, and fathers were being separated from their homes, particularly fathers of color in low-income communities around this country, we didn't have an example of a good father. So when Good Times hit the airwaves, all of a sudden, fatherhood crystallized for us. And it was something that we had never seen before. I had never seen before. And it's like, oh my goodness, this is what a father is? Are you telling me this is what should be in my household? This is what I need? And then I began to start asking the questions, why don't I have that? Where is he? Why is he not here? And who did I begin to blame for that? My mother. Because I was being exposed to something that she didn't know how to give me. But I had questions about how to do that. And so about 15 years ago in New York, I had a dinner. And I was fortunate enough for him to be the keynote speaker at my dinner. And he came to New York, and we spent 3 whole days together. Imagine that. My childhood idol, the man that I thought I was my father. I spent 3 days with him, eating, laughing, talking, celebrating, all of those things. And I got a chance to tell him something that I've always wanted to tell him. And I had the moment to tell him this. And it was something that I felt that all, particularly black boys, who ever looked at him as a father, wanted to say to him. And it was, in the 4th season, in the first episode of the 4th season, when they killed him off of the series of Good Times, while the Evans family lost a father, I did too. And I grieved over him. And I just grieved over him a week ago when I found out he passed away again. So I've lost him twice in my life. Twice in my life. And the way that we have lost him greatly disturbs my soul. Well, he is a man who is not worthy of passing in the way that he did, with all of the questions around how he passed away. And the fact that the world, his kids, me, didn't know that he passed away until 30 days after. And none of us has been able to grieve correctly about him, which is something that I am on task to figure out how to rectify and to reinvigorate his imagery, who he was. He was not only James Amos, but he was also in Roots. Remember him in Roots? Iconic characters, iconic man. And the reason I'm telling you this story, gentlemen in the room today, is because everything you do in life and every relationship you encounter with people will determine how people treat you when you can't take care of yourself. Which is why it's so important to be great fathers. Because who else better to take care of you when you are older and not able to take care of yourself, but the people that you raise? And how hurtful would it be for you if the people that you raise are the people who most not want to do anything for you in your most need? That's why it's important to be great fathers. Availability matters. Presence matters. Engagement matters. Affirmation matters. Focusing on your children matters, and empathy matters. So let me tell you this story. Take me about 7 minutes to tell you this story. Today I was interrupted by a familiar sound. But before I tell you about that, let me tell you about my new life. I'm in a small place, in a small space, with a small pace. My office. The place that I began to call my home just a few months before. Away from the sights and sounds of my birthplace, where fashion never repeats, coats are made of sheep, and the city never sleeps. Come to think of it, I traded one apple to which every step I took and everyone in that city took a bite. And I traded that for the multitude of apples that lace the rolling green hills of upstate New York. No more corner bodegas, just strips of mall. It's the place where I traded a biggie for small. Oh yeah, the sound. On any given day, you can find me in my cubicle responding to customers with bank issues and complaints. And with each ringing of the phone, I brace for someone who could make my day with a kind good morning or launch my mood into a tailspin because what they knew about dollars didn't make sense. It was during these calls that I learned that your money could be funny, but at some time, there ain't nothing to laugh about. Kenny, you have a call on line 1 in the quiet yell of a small office. She said she's your mom. My mom didn't call often, in fact, almost never. You see, we didn't grow up in the apple pie, biscuit baking, Easter hat on Sunday, Mom. I feel like during our entire existence together under one roof, we were just trying to stay out of each other's way. In fact, when I look back, I think she was on a mission, a quest to prove to the naysayers in that small town in North Carolina that she could remove her 3-year-old son, move to the big city, and make it alone. I don't remember much about that time of my life, but I know she worked diligently to ensure that we had the little bit we had. She loved me, that I knew. However, to the extent possible, I never wanted to be in the way of that process, and more importantly, never be the reason for her disappointment. Kenny, in that low, soft-spoken, rhythmic tone of my mom. Hey, Mom, where are you? I'm at work. What are you doing? I'm working, I said with a little frustration at the small talk. Oh, okay. Doug died. Wait, what? Doug died. The funeral is on Saturday. After a silent pause, okay, Mom. Mind rent, smashed by wavelengths, lay waste to streams of thought, hollow emotion. A full tank of gas and an empty heart carried me as exit 24 turned to 23, 19 turned to 18, Yonkers turned into the Bronx, Queens turned into Brooklyn, and New Lots Avenue turned into the Pickett Avenue projects. The ride from my mother's house to the funeral was as quiet as the journey to New York City. How could a hot summer day in June, heat waves rising from the concrete, sunlight blazing through the windshield be so cold, so empty, so meaningless? It was like I was accompanying a friend to a funeral of someone I didn't know. As we walked into the funeral parlor, wondering why we weren't at a church, The pews were filled with people who knew my father differently than I. Folks who had fond memories, shared funny moments, people who had a relationship with my father. "Oh my goodness, is that you?" shrieked a middle-aged woman with no familiarity to me. And in that moment, I'm not sure if she was talking to me or not, but there was something about me that she recognized. "Hey, Doc, it's good to see you." I swiveled my head fast enough to see the look on my mother's face. I recognize that face because it shows up when she's talking to somebody she wasn't really feeling. Dorothy had come a long way from Doc. It was the same name I heard when she visited Pine Tops, North Carolina. Obviously, the endearing name of a much younger Dorothy. I could also hear her called that by some of her very close and personal friends. "Hey," with a quarter of a smile and struggling to laugh, and that customary half hug. To this day, I don't know who that woman was and never dared to ask. However, on the inside and for a moment, I found something to laugh about. She was probably one of my family members who gave my mom some shade back in her high school days. Maybe she shared a romantic love entanglement from back in the day, who knows? I learned a long time ago not to get in the middle of Black women drama. "Come down to the front. We have seats for you." "Kenny, you go. I'm going to sit here in the back," says my mother with a frustrated tone. She was obviously not letting go of whatever just plucked her nerves. Well, one turn of her head, flipping of her hair, and switching of her hips, my mom was walking the one way, and me and Miss Thing was walking the other. Pew 1, seat 1. It's the seat commonly reserved for the First Lady of the church. As I looked down the row, I saw my dad's wife, whom I recognized, a few of my siblings, and others that I did not know. Not unnoticed, were the few pairs of eyes beaming down on me and trying to figure out who I was. In front of me, my father. Momentary glances of him as people passed by to give their respects, and the occasional "sorry for your loss. You look just like your daddy," and I remember then comments. I can remember sitting there reading the obituary and saying to myself, "Damn, the typewriter that made this mess must have been old as heck." For real, hand-drawn prayer hands, uneven letters, and even a paragraph where somebody drew a line to correct a misspelled name. Ooh, was that petty? Oh well. At that moment, it was the only comfortable emotion I could muster. In the obituary are the names of my siblings, 8 to be exact. 1 sister and 7 brothers. 1 shackled in the back of the funeral parlor, surrounded by the police that would eventually escort him down the aisle to give his final goodbyes to our dad in chains. Donovan, Kenneth, Dwight, Keith, Rodney, Yvonne, Christopher, and Shamika, in that order. Reading this was like listening to a bio at the beginning of a keynote speech. As I go on, I learned that he served in the Army. He was a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne. He was a Sunday school teacher with aspirations of becoming a deacon, and he also oversaw committees within his church, including transportation. He was married in 1965. I was born in 1961. My mother moved to New York in 1964. And based on the order of my siblings in the obituary, I am 2 of 8. My petty just turned into something else. The math was hurting my head, but the logic was clear. How could he be married for 30 years, remain committed and engaged in the lives of my other siblings, serve this country, his church, but couldn't find himself to find me? It had been 14 years since I finally reconnected with my father. Fresh home from the military, a childhood friend ran into my mother on Pickett Avenue while shopping, and in the following days arranged for my father and I to meet. In the days and years between then and now, we saw each other a few times as our small talk became smaller and smaller and smaller. Until then, there was none. Never did any of what I was reading come up in conversation? A fault of his or mine, I don't know. Yet one more indicator that he did not know how to find me. My rise to anger was broken by an usher. The moment I had been dreading is now my turn. My turn to yell, cry, talk, reason, confess, chastise, argue, fall on a casket, all of the cliche things that I've seen people do on TV at Black funerals. But standing there looking over him, I noticed the church sound settled to a deafening quiet. In this moment, I could only hear the echoes of my heartbeat and the church fan in the rear of the funeral parlor. I wondered if the entire church were waiting to see what I was going to do or say. Little did anyone know, including myself, that the rest of my life would be dedicated to responding to this moment, the death of my father. A life dedicated to chasing the echoes of both his absence and his brief presence, revisiting this pain over and over and over and over again, answering and responding to the whys of little boys and girls suffering from some level of father absence, sacrificing my heart and time to strengthen fathers one family at a time. It was at this moment, looking down on him, full of my own whys, waiting for something to speak to me, that I realized that it wasn't me attending this funeral, but it was the little boy inside of me, yearning to know, wanting to know, deserving to know, who would now never know. Today, my purpose was born. My calling was cemented. I turned around without a goodbye, so long, or see you later, and I walked back up the aisle, my mother falling into cadence with every step we walked out the door. It would be 8 years before the pain would stimulate me into my work, but today the die was cast, and my life would never be the same. This is where the story of my work and my healing begins. One of the things I learned that day was there are two stories, and oftentimes more than two stories. And those stories define us. It tells us who we are, and it allows us to discover the things that we don't know about ourselves. But the thing about stories is stories must merge with facts. How many of you have created a story in your mind without having a fact about somebody? Raise your hand. Don't be honest. This is an honest room. We have conjured up in our minds who this person is and who this person was without a shred of evidence. Only what we have created as a result of the pain in our hearts. These two gentlemen, Douglas Applewhite is my biological father. He was the one that I just talked to you about. The story I have never told, and I'm still trying to figure out how to tell, is that of Joshua Charles, who came into my life as my stepfather, who I never recognized for his contributions in my life, because I always said in my brain, he's not my father. How many of you have seen the famous scene that we all in the fatherhood field go back to in Fresh Prince? That ending scene where his father is talking to him and he comes to this place where he is done with his father. And after his father leaves, he falls into the arms of his uncle. And he asks his uncle, why doesn't he want me? Remember that scene? I've watched that scene 500 times and I cry still every time I watch it because I know what that feels like. But go back and watch that entire episode, because I believe that that is not the most powerful scene in that show. There was a scene that happened before that people never go back and analyze and look at that. And it was the scene where him and his father had gone to a fair, and they were coming into the house, and both of them were holding stuffed animals. Remember that? And he comes into the house, and Uncle Phil begins to tell Will, "You're stupid for believing in him. He's just going to leave you again. Why are you putting yourself into this man?" And they get into an argument in the kitchen. And what is the last thing that Will says to his father before he storms out of the door? You remember? "You are not my father." Imagine that. Imagine that. Took him in from West Philadelphia, born and raised on the playground is where he spent most of his days. Took him in with his own kids. Gave him everything he's ever needed, everything he's ever wanted. Availability, affirmation, resources, protection. And a man who you know as your father comes into your life after not being into your life for years and years and years. And all of a sudden you turn to the man who's been there all the time for you and you say, "You're not my father." It is the most damaging thing for a man who steps up into the space of another man who's not being responsible for the child that he's raising, to look in his face and tell him that you're not who you think you are. It's why I always say to men, and this is something that you should take into consideration if you are a stepfather. Never step into another man's shoes. Never, ever, 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 ever step into another man's shoes. My middle daughter, Amber, who came into my life at 7 years old, she's my wife's only child before our son. I'm the only thing she's ever known as dad. One day I was dropping her off at school, and I picked her up, and I picked her up and we was coming home. And she's always in the back seat, and she always called me Kenny. And she said, "Kenny," and I said, "What?" And she says, "Do I have to call you Dad?" And I said, "Absolutely not." I said, "What made you ask me that question?" She says, "Because all my friends always ask if you're my father." And I said, "What am I to you?" And she says, "You're my mother's boyfriend." That's what she said. I was like, more than that. It's like, with kids, you gotta pull some stuff out, because one of the things I learned about kids, they're gonna tell you the truth first. Then you have to get the real meaning, what they're trying to say afterwards. And I said, "No, beyond that." I said, "For you, not for your mom. What am I to you?" And it took her a minute, and she couldn't, I think it was, she couldn't come up with the words to explain who I was. And I broke her silence and I said, "I'm Kenny." And I said, "And whatever Kenny means to you, it means the same thing to me. You don't ever have to call me Dad. You know why? Because when I hear Kenny, I hear Dad." And when you say Kenny, if that's what you want to hear, you can hear Dad. You never have to say it. That's our thing. So on my cards for Father's Day, Amber always writes, "My Kenny." Not supposed to be crying, y'all. But we having real talk, right? As fathers in focus. One of the things I'm trying to attempt is really do exactly what I believe Dr. Thomas and others are trying to do at this university and beyond, which is the criticalness of bringing fathers in focus. Because too often they go out of focus. But I think it's empathy and stories that bring them back into focus. So the work, the research, the servicing, the curriculum, all of those things are great, But if those things are happening in isolation to the story, we're going to be out of focus. And we're never going to get to the thing we're trying to get to, which is in our particular space of work, ensuring that people understand that at the end of the day, our goal is healthy child well-being. Say that with me. Our goal is healthy child well-being. We just choose to do that through strengthening fathers. You can do that however you want to do it. If you want to strengthen moms, then fine, go do that. If you want to strengthen children, then fine, then go do that. If you want to strengthen that through housing, child support, substance abuse, domestic violence, fine, go do that. But I get to do it my way. And what you can't come in is into my space and force me to validate why I have a calling to work with fathers. Amen. It's not up to you. And I don't need you in my space if that's the conversation we're having. And that's how we bring fathers back into focus. I heard Dr. Danielle say something when she said it, like I'm really literal on words, and when she says it, I gotta make sure that she changes that word. And she talked about, I don't know if she used the word change, but she said change. It was something in context, paraphrasing, it was change the narrative. And I believe, particularly for fathers, and I saw another word today, and I was like, man, because I used to always say, I would change the narrative, to expose the narrative. And because the narrative of dads have always been there. We ain't telling a new story. We're not telling a new story. And the craziness about the research is it's confirming that we're not telling a new story. Yet we want to act like every time we talk about fathers, it's something new. And especially for black fathers. That man that I showed you in the beginning was the narrative. And that was the narrative. It just got lost in a bunch of other craziness that was going on, and we got distracted from what was happening in our households. Because prior to that, 10 years before that, 85% of all households in America had both mom and dad in the household. 85%. Something happened. And it wasn't that dads decided on one day that we don't want to be involved anymore. It was not that. And research is showing that. And you guys need to understand your value and be unapologetic in the spaces that you're in about who you are and what you're trying to accomplish in the way that you're trying to accomplish it through strengthening families one father at a time. Because you know what? When father's doing good, mama's doing good. When father's doing good, children doing good. In my house, when father's doing good, dog doing good. Everybody doing good. And as a result of that, the community does good. Your schools do well. Your jobs do well. There's nothing like going into a school environment and seeing the school environment overwhelmed with father presence. And those people in those schools will tell you the value of having men and having fathers in their school settings. When fathers walk into the building and how they change the dynamic of the atmosphere and the environment. And this ain't Kenneth Braswell just talking off the top of my head. Research is showing that when fathers show up into those spaces, they bring a whole nother energy. I often tell people, and this is just theoretic, I don't have any, maybe we have to do some research on this, Dr. Shen. Mothers are the thermometer, daddies are the thermostat. Mothers are the thermometer, daddies are the thermostat. We set the temperature. Think about for you guys who are married and you go home. Does the atmosphere or does it not match your energy when you walk in the door? Moms, women, y'all can attest to this too. I know it in my house. Whatever my energy is, when I bring it into the house, everything else mirrors my energy. And I could say women are the thermometer, but the house is the thermometer. If I come in and I set the house temperature at 95 and it's hot, everybody's attitude in the house gonna be hot. Everybody's gonna be on edge. Everybody's not gonna know what's going on. But if I come in and I'm cool, calm, and collective, I'm laughing, I'm telling stupid dad jokes, I'm laughing at this, I'm joking, the whole house mirrors my energy. It's important that you know that. So when you go home and you've had a hard day, men, sometimes you gotta circle the block. Don't bring your world into your house. I don't care what it is. If you have to have the quiet moment where you're talking to your wife and maybe even talking to your kids, create that moment. But don't let the world dictate the temperature in your house. And don't let the world dictate the temperature for your children. That's why empathy is important. So I'm going to close. I got a whole bunch of slides here because I'm telling a story. I can really tell you stories for the next 3 or 4 hours, but I'm not going to do that to you. So I'm going to end my story with this right here. And that is a quote from Denzel Washington in Equalizer 2 that says that there are 2 kinds of pain in the world, the pain that hurts and the pain that alters. The question for the one that hurts and alters is, what do you do with that pain? How do you harness that pain? For those of you who are practitioners working in this space, and for those of you who are also dads, how do you take the pain of your stories, like I did, crystallize those things for me so that I can see what it is and understand what it is and turn that pain into prosperity? Make that pain good. Because I know that for my mother, my single mom in Brooklyn, New York, who struggled to keep the lights on, food on the table, that in the process of her doing that, she must have come home many days in pain. But I never heard it, I never saw it, and I never felt it. But I know now as an adult that pain existed for her. But she chose to do something different with it. So dads, those of you who are in here who's had a tough journey in your life trying to be a father, whether it is fighting with child support, fighting with policy, fighting with laws, fighting with self-esteem, fighting with your wife, fighting with your girlfriend, fighting with your baby mamas, whatever you're going through right now, you have got to find the support and the accountability circles that allows you to take what I describe as temporary pain and turn it into positive prosperity and parenting. That's my story. I'm sticking with it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. Anybody have any questions, comments? Just a couple, because I know we're up on time. Comments, questions? I'll be surprised if I don't get one, or somebody got to give me something. I've been talking for a while. There you go in the back. And here, next. Loud and clear.
How do you feel your relationship that you had with your real father changed you or molded you to be a father to your children now?
I had to continue to explore the story. And so for those of you who don't know, I also have a documentary called Spit and Anger. And when I created that documentary, I wanted to tell the story of the pain specifically of Black boys as it related to absent fathers. And so we're going through this process, we get in this documentary. I got Gary Sheffield, who used to play for the Mets. I got Ayanna Van Zandt. I got all these high-profile people in this documentary. And I get to the editor, and we're down in Atlanta, and he's piecing stuff together, and he says, "Where's your voice?" And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" He's like, "How come you're not in this documentary?" And this is what I said to him. I said, "I'm not trying to be the story. I want to tell the story." And his response to me was, "You are the story." Like, nobody wants to, you have to know Jenks to know Jenks. Who cares about what Ayanna Van Zandt, Gary Jeffield, and all these other high-profile people that you got here talking about? People don't want to know that. They want to know your story. And he focused me for 3 days sitting in a chair, extracting my story out of me, for me to really understand who my father is. So at the end of the documentary, there's this scene that I hate watching till this day, right? But it just even looks different from the rest of the film, because the rest of the film looks dark and dingy. And this scene in the back is on a river, and it's light, and the water is flowing, and leaves are splashing, and birds are flying. And I said, what I understand now about my dad is that I only really have one responsibility to him. And it wasn't to like him, it was to honor him. And I have to honor him because he was 50% responsible for me coming into this world. May not be responsible for who I am today, but if it wasn't for that 50% contribution, I wouldn't be here. So I flipped how I started thinking about him, from thinking about his contribution to begin to start thinking about who he was in the space of creating me. And if it wasn't for him, and how can I not honor someone who was responsible for bringing life to me, him and my mom, because there's a whole mom story too. Hope that helps. Hope that answers the question. And last one.
Good morning, thanks for the talk. Would you be willing to, since your main point is empathy, would you be willing just to share a little bit of what empathy means to you, like a definition, and help everyone kind of understand what empathy really is? Because I think empathy, there we go. That's it. And I just think, I see the power of empathy, self-empathy, and empathy for others. But I think what's challenging is a lot of people don't fully understand what empathy really means. And so I would love for you just to speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, we'll say that I think that, what's your name, sir?
Peter.
Peter. Peter, I think that one of the problems with empathy is that we confuse it with sympathy. And sympathy is easy. It's easy to watch tragedy and say, oh, wow, that's bad, and go on about your life. It's not as easy to look at something and say, I need to feel what that person is feeling. I need to understand what that person is dealing with. I need to put myself deeper into that person's story so that I can begin to feel and empathize with what that person is doing. For the most part, humans don't like doing that. And let me tell you the moment of the day that humans repel from being empathetic. How many of you were approached today, this morning, and someone said, how are you doing? Did you really tell them how you were doing? You did? Some people bold like you, sir, me. It's like, don't ask me how I'm doing if you don't want to know. But most people don't. Hey, how you doing? Good. I'm fine. It's all right. Knowing that your entire world is in shambles. But you won't tell people how you're feeling. And the reason that you don't do that is because you know that how are you doing was the sympathetic response. The empathetic response is, whoa, 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 whoa. I know you, Peter. I see you every day. I see your aura, I see your demeanor. You're not okay. What's going on, bro? That's the empathetic response. But the empathetic response commands time, understanding, focus, listening, and not you talking. As I always tell people, so being empathetic to that response is a little different from complaining. So what I will say to someone is, don't bring me your complaints unless you want to hear mine. Right? But when we're trying to be empathetic, it is really showing up. And for our kids, for dads, being empathetic to others shows up with our children, because empathetic in our kids shows up where we are listening more than we're talking. Right? We're looking at our Gen Z kids and our Alpha Gens. How many of y'all got Gen Z kids or Alpha kids? They are different. That's a whole nother workshop. They're a whole nother thing, right? And so, but empathy for us as baby boomers, Gen X, and hip hop generation is to shut up, stop talking, and listen to what they're saying. Because you can't understand what they're going through. You don't understand what it means to live in this social media world that they're in, where they can't believe anything because facts aren't facts. And you can get bullied by someone you never saw. Your child could end their lives because they feel isolated, because no one knows and no one has been empathetic enough to really know that the behavior of that child is changing. And it can all be stimulated by someone at their school who they don't even know who it is. That is crazy to me. And then we say, oh, back in the day. Don't nobody care about back in the day. Leave back in the day, back in the day. Because back in the day don't mean jack right now. With the exception of principles. There are principles that hold true no matter where. But the work and the listening and the empathy and how we respond to our children has to be listened first, empathy second, response third. Not like back in the day, response first, listen never, empathy forget it. Does that make sense? Well, all y'all seasoned people like me, y'all remember that. It's a different equation. And so that's why empathy is so important. And it's also important for service providers, because I think empathy should be a core responsibility of providing services for fathers.
Awesome.